The sale was nearly done. The representative from the development company had signed his copy. The bank's attorney, a young man named Davies with a sharp suit and an easy smile, slid the papers across the polished veneer of the conference table. He spoke to the branch manager, Henderson, a formality, a simple transaction. $8,500 for a useless strip of land the bank had repossessed months ago. It was a good deal for everyone. The bank cleared a non-performing asset from its books. The developer got the final piece needed for their access road. A win-win. Then the door opened. Helen Vance walked in. She did not knock, she did not wait to be acknowledged. She moved with the quiet economy of someone who had already decided on every step before she left her house that morning. She wore a simple wool coat, the kind that lasts for 30 years, and sensible shoes. In her hand she carried a single manila envelope, yellowed at the edges, softened by time. The men at the table stopped talking. They watched her cross the room. She walked past the empty client chairs, past the ficus tree dying in the corner, and stopped at the head of the table. She placed the envelope on the wood. The sound was soft, just the whisper of old paper on laminate. No words, no hesitation. Davies was the first to recover. His professional smile returned, a well-practiced tool. "Who is this?" he asked Henderson with his eyes. Henderson gave a slight, nervous shake of his head. He knew her, of course. Helen Vance, Frank Vance's widow. Frank had been a customer for 50 years, Helen for 51. "May we help you, ma'am?" Davies asked, his voice smooth. "We're just concluding a bit of business here." Helen looked at the papers on the table, then at the developer's man, then back at Davies. Her gaze was steady. It held no anger. It held no fear. It was simply present. "I believe you are," she said. Her voice was low but clear in the quiet room. "That business concerns a parcel of land. My husband's land." Davies' smile tightened. He glanced at the file in front of him. Parcel 7B, foreclosed 6 months ago. Default on an agricultural equipment loan from 1994. Everything was in order, legal, correct, triple-checked. "It was," he corrected her gently, "the bank's land now, which we have just sold." Helen's eyes did not leave his. "You sold the soil," she answered. "You didn't sell the right to walk on it. That land can't be used." A pause. The developer's man let out a short, sharp laugh of disbelief. Henderson shifted in his chair, the cheap fabric groaning under his weight. Davies, for the first time, looked uncertain. He looked down at the old envelope on the table as if it were a snake. He had handled dozens of these small-town property deals. They were always simple. An old woman, confused about her husband's affairs, grieving, mistaken. It was a sad but common story. He would be gentle but firm. He would explain the legal realities. He would set her straight. He picked up the envelope. The paper felt brittle, ancient. He assumed it contained a will or an old invalid deed, something emotional but ultimately irrelevant. He was wrong. The assumption was his first mistake. It would not be his last. He had no idea that the contents of that envelope, signed and filed in 1976, had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. Some men collect problems. Frank Vance, it turned out, had collected patience and left it for his wife to spend. The conference room was a monument to inexpensive corporate taste. The walls were a shade of beige that absorbed light and optimism. The fluorescent fixtures in the dropped ceiling hummed a low, constant note of institutional indifference. On the wall hung a framed print of a sailboat, its sails full on a sea hundreds of miles from this landlocked county. It was a room designed for transactions, not conversations. It was a place where numbers were meant to feel more important than people. The air conditioning clicked on, a sudden, rattling intrusion. The developer's representative, a man whose name nobody had bothered to use twice, checked his phone. He had another meeting across the state in 3 hours. This was supposed to be a 10-minute stop. Davies held the envelope, turning it over in his hands. He looked at Helen again, trying to fit her into a category he understood. Grieving widow, confused elderly, local eccentric. None of them seemed quite right. Her calmness was a disruption. It wasn't the frantic energy of someone fighting a losing battle. It was the quiet stillness of someone who had already won and was just waiting for everyone else to realize it. She wore no jewelry except a simple, thin wedding band. Her hands were clean but weathered, the hands of a woman who had gardened and cooked and worked for over half a century. There was a small speck of dried mud on the cuff of her coat. The attorney decided on his approach, sympathetic but firm. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice taking on a softer, more condescending tone, "I understand this must be difficult. Property law can be very confusing. When the bank forecloses on a property due to an unpaid loan, it takes possession of the title. That title gives it the right to sell the land to another party. It's a standard, legally sound procedure. We have the recorded deed right here." He patted a thick folder on the table. Helen said nothing. She just waited. The silence was more powerful than any argument. It created a vacuum in the room, forcing Davies to keep talking, to keep explaining, to fill the space she refused to occupy. He continued, "So, whatever is in this envelope, I'm afraid it can't change the fact of the foreclosure. The matter was settled in court months ago. Notices were sent." "Yes," Helen said, "I received them. I know you own the parcel." "I'm not disputing that. I'm telling you what you sold. You sold a box without a key." The developer's man looked up from his phone. "What is she talking about?" Davies held up a hand to placate him. "Let's just see what this is." He slid a finger under the flap of the envelope. The old glue crackled. He pulled out a single sheet of paper folded in 3. It was heavy, fibrous, and covered in dense typewritten text. At the top, in a faded letterhead, were the words Pan X Minerals Corporation. Below that, Surface Use and Mineral Rights Lease Agreement. He scanned the document. His eyes caught the date. March 12th, 1976. He saw Frank Vance's signature at the bottom, strong and clear. He also saw a notarized stamp and a county filing number in the margin. His professional calm began to fray at the edges. This was not a will. This was a recorded instrument. It was a complication. He didn't like complications. They cost time, and time cost money. But he was still confident. A 44-year-old mineral lease with a defunct company? It was a ghost, a piece of paper with no power. He would exercise it quickly. To understand why Helen Vance was standing in that bank, you have to go back 3 months, to a cold Tuesday in early spring. She was in her husband's small office, a room that smelled of old books, pipe tobacco, and sawdust. Frank had been gone for nearly a year, and the weight of his absence was still a physical presence in the house. She had finally worked up the strength to sort through his desk, a massive oak roll-top that he had called his fortress of solitude. It was filled with the accumulated paperwork of a long and careful life. Tax returns from the Nixon administration, warranties for appliances long since gone to the scrapyard, manuals for tractors he had rebuilt engine block by engine block. In the bottom right-hand drawer, tucked behind a stack of almanacs, was a small shoebox. On the lid, in Frank's neat, deliberate handwriting, was a single word: contingencies. Helen sat on his old wooden chair and lifted the lid. Inside was not chaos, but order. There were life insurance policies, the deed to their house, and the title to her old sedan. There were instructions for the well pump, and a hand-drawn map of the septic field. And at the very bottom, there was the manila envelope. She almost dismissed it. Pan X Minerals, she remembered them vaguely. Men in a dusty sedan who had come around in the mid-70s leasing mineral rights from all the farmers in the valley. Nothing ever came of it. The company vanished as quietly as it had arrived. Most people forgot it had ever existed, but Frank hadn't forgotten. He had planned. She took the envelope to the kitchen table and poured herself a cup of coffee. She unfolded the lease agreement and began to read. The legal language was dense, a thicket of wherefores and parties of the first part, but Helen read slowly. She used a dictionary for the words she didn't know. She had finished high school, and that was all, but she had a lifetime of experience in reading instructions, recipes, and patterns. She knew how to follow a thread. An hour passed, then another. She traced the lines of text with her finger, her lips moving silently, and then she found it. Paragraph 4, subsection C. It was a strange clause, one she was sure the company lawyer had thought was meaningless, a small concession to a stubborn farmer. It stated that if Pan-X Minerals Corporation, the grantee, should ever be dissolved, liquidated, or otherwise cease to exist as a legal entity, all rights and restrictions detailed in the agreement would not terminate. They would not become void. Instead, they would revert in their entirety to the grantor, Frank R. Vance, or his designated heir. Not to the property owner, not to the land itself, to him, personally. It was a covenant designed to follow a man, not a parcel.
The next day, she drove the 30 miles to the county seat. She went to the Hall of Records, a dusty, quiet place in the courthouse basement. She gave the filing number from the lease to the clerk at the counter. The clerk, a woman near her own age, with kind eyes and an efficient manner, disappeared into the stacks. 10 minutes later, she returned with a heavy, leather-bound ledger. She opened it to the correct page. There it was, March 12, 1976. The lease had been filed not as a simple lien, which could be wiped out by a foreclosure, but as a deed covenant, an enduring restriction on the land itself, superior to any subsequent mortgage or loan. It was a ghost, yes, but it was a ghost with a legal chain, permanently attached to Parcel 7B. Helen spent the next 2 days in that basement, reading. She looked at foreclosure law. She looked at property rights statutes from the 70s. She did not hire a lawyer. She could not afford one. Instead, she did the work. She made copies.
She highlighted sentences. She learned, and she waited for the notice that the bank had sold the land. When it came, she put her copy of the lease and the recorded filing into the old manila envelope, put on her good wool coat, and drove to the bank. The memory of that day at the kitchen table in 1976 was as clear as the view from her window. Frank sat across from her, his big, calloused hands flat on the table. Between them sat the man from Pan-X Minerals, a young man in a cheap suit, sweating slightly in the heat of the late spring afternoon. He was confident. He was charming. He had a briefcase full of identical lease agreements and a pocket full of $20 bills for signing bonuses. He'd already signed up half the county. It was easy money, he explained, for rights to something no one was even sure was there. A geological survey had suggested a possibility of shale gas deep underground. Probably nothing, but if it was something, everyone would get rich. Frank listened. He didn't look at the money. He looked at the paper. He read every word. The man from Pan-X checked his watch. He had other farms to visit. "Come on, Frank," he'd said with a friendly smile. "It's a standard agreement." Frank shook his head slowly. "I don't sign standard agreements," he said. "I sign my agreements." He pointed a thick finger at one of the paragraphs. "This here. It says the lease is for 99 years. I'll be dead. My wife will be dead. My boy will be in his 70s. 99 years is as good as forever." The man sighed. "It's just boilerplate language, Frank. A formality." Frank didn't care what it was called. He slid the paper back across the table. No, thank you. The man from Panex was frustrated. He saw his commission walking out the door. Wait, what's the problem? What do you want? I want to know what happens to my land, Frank said. Not the dirt, the rights. What happens if your company drills a few holes and then goes belly up in 10 years?
Who owns the right to come on my property then? Does some other company buy it out of bankruptcy for $1? Does a stranger get to put a pump jack where my son plays? No. He explained what he wanted. A reversion clause. If Panex ceased to exist, the rights came back. Not to the property, to him. Personally. To his family. The man from Panex argued for a while, but Frank was immovable. He was a quiet man, but his convictions were like the granite bedrock under his fields. Finally, the man gave in. It was a ridiculous request, he thought, a legal absurdity that would never matter. What were the chances? He took out a pen, crossed out a section, and hand-wrote Frank's clause into the margins of all 3 copies. Frank watched him, then had him initial the change. Then they both signed. Helen was the witness. They drove to the courthouse the next day, and Frank paid the fee to have it recorded himself. He didn't trust the company to do it right. He came home and put his copy in the shoebox. He told Helen, "Some things you plant for the next season, and some things you plant for the next man. You just have to make sure the seed is good." That land, parcel 7B, was a scrubby little piece of hillside he'd bought for a song. He used it as collateral years later, in 1994, for a loan to buy a new John Deere combine. He'd made the payments faithfully for 25 years. After he got sick, things slipped. After he died, Helen tried to keep up, but the pension was small and the medical bills were large. The small loan for the old combine was the one she let go. The bank had been polite but firm. They had foreclosed. She had let them. She knew they were taking the soil. She also knew about the seed Frank had planted, waiting patiently in the dark. Back in the sterile, air-conditioned present, Davies finished reading the document. A faint smile played on his lips. He had found the flaw.
He had the argument that would dismantle this old woman's fantasy. He laid the paper down carefully on the table, lining its edges up with the edge of his leather folio. It was a gesture of control, of order restored. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice now patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "I see what you have here. It's a mineral lease. And you're correct, it was filed with the county. However, this lease is with a company called Panex Minerals." He tapped the letterhead with a manicured fingernail. "I can tell you from experience with these old filings that Panex went bankrupt and was dissolved in 1988. I was still in law school, but these cases were famous. The company is gone. It no longer exists. Therefore, this contract is null and void. It has no legal force." He leaned back in his chair, the picture of confident authority. He had identified the defunct party. He had declared the contract void. Case closed. He looked at the developer's man and gave a slight nod as if to say, "See, handled." Helen did not look flustered. She did not argue. She simply leaned forward slightly and pointed to the middle of the page. "You didn't read it all," she said, a voice still quiet, still calm. "Please read paragraph 4, subsection C." Davies's smile faltered. He picked up the paper again, his annoyance showing for the first time. He found the section she indicated. His eyes scanned the handwritten words in the margin, the words the man from Panex had written down that hot afternoon in 1976. He read them once. Then he read them again. "In the event the grantee, Panex Minerals Corporation, is dissolved or otherwise ceases to exist, all surface use rights, easements, and covenants herein shall revert in full to the grantor, Frank R. Vance, or his legal heir, and shall not be transferable through bankruptcy proceedings or to any succeeding entity." The room was silent. save for the hum of the lights.
The words just hung there in the air.
The developer's man was leaning forward now, his impatience replaced by a sharp, predatory interest. Henderson, the bank manager, was starting to look pale. He was from here. He had known Frank Vance. He knew what kind of man he had been, a man who read the fine print. Davies cleared his throat. He placed the paper down again, more slowly this time. He was a lawyer. He was trained to think on his feet, to pivot, to find a new line of attack. The first had failed. Time for the second. "All right," he said, shifting his tone to one of peer-to-peer legal reasoning. He was no longer talking to a confused widow. He was making a technical legal argument. "I see the clause. It's unusual. But it doesn't change the fundamental reality of the situation. A foreclosure by a primary lien holder, which the bank was, extinguishes subsequent and subordinate claims against the property. The bank's mortgage from 1994 predates any inheritance you might have claimed.
The foreclosure action would have wiped this covenant from the title. That's black-letter law. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who believed in the power of established procedure. The bank always came first. The mortgage was senior. Everything else was secondary. It was the natural order of his world. Helen reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a second folded paper. It was a crisp, clean photocopy. She unfolded it and placed it on the table next to the original lease. It was a copy of the page from the county ledger, the page from 1976. She had highlighted a section in yellow. The filing was recorded as a superior deed covenant, she stated, not a subordinate lien. It was attached to the deed before the mortgage was ever issued. It runs with the land. Your foreclosure wiped out the liens that came after it. It didn't touch the restrictions that came before it. Davies stared at the photocopy. He knew what a deed covenant was. It was a restriction so fundamental it was almost part of the land itself, like a river or a cliff.
It was not a debt to be wiped away. It was a fact to be honored. His confidence, his entire professional demeanor began to crumble. He had built his case on the foundation of assumptions, and this quiet woman was knocking out the pillars one by one. He felt a flush of anger. He was being made to look foolish in front of a client. He fell back on his third and final argument, the one lawyers use when the law is not on their side. An appeal to money and practicality. He softened his voice again, trying to sound reasonable, conciliatory. "Mrs. Vance, Helen, look, let's be practical here. This is a piece of scrubland worth $8,500. You're holding up a multi-million-dollar development project over a technicality from 40 years ago. What is it you actually want? Clearly, you've come here for something, a negotiation. Is it money?"
The bank is prepared to be reasonable. To resolve this unfortunate oversight, we can offer you a settlement. $1,000 for your trouble. Let's be done with this.
He thought the offer was generous. $1,000 for an old piece of paper. For a woman who had just lost the land, it should have been a welcome windfall. He waited for her acceptance. Helen Vance looked at him. She looked at the $1,000 he had conjured out of the air. She thought of Frank, of his principles. It was never about the money. It was about the land. It was about the promise. She said nothing. Her silence was her answer. It was a refusal so complete, so profound, that it left no room for another offer. The $1,000 evaporated, an insult hanging in the quiet air. The game was over. He just didn't know it yet. The silence in the room stretched out. It was no longer a respectful pause. It was a tense, uncomfortable void. The developer's man finally broke it. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his face a mask of frustration. "I'm not a lawyer," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the quiet. "But I know a deal killer when I see one. Is what she's saying true? Can I use this land or not?" He looked from Davies to Henderson, demanding a straight answer. Davies avoided his gaze. He shuffled the papers on the table, buying a few seconds to think. His legal arguments had evaporated. His offer of money had been met with a wall of silent dignity. He was out of moves. Henderson, the branch manager, finally spoke. He was a local man. He had been with this bank for 30 years. He had seen strange old deeds and property line disputes his whole career. He knew that in these rural counties, the paper in the courthouse basement was gospel. I think we should verify this, he stammered. Let's just call the county recorder. Davies shot him a sharp look. He didn't want outside verification.
He wanted to control the narrative, to handle this in-house. But it was too late. Henderson was already dialing his desk phone, pressing the button for the speaker. The developer's man stood with his arms crossed, waiting. Helen sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. The phone rang twice, then a calm, older woman's voice filled the room. County Recorder's office. This is Eleanor Gable speaking. Henderson cleared his throat. Eleanor, it's Jim Henderson over at the bank. I've got a bit of a situation here. A question about an old filing on a parcel. Of course, Jim. What's the parcel number? Henderson read the number from the file. Davies interjected, trying to frame the question his way. Eleanor, what we have is a foreclosure on that parcel, which we then sold. A party has now produced a 1976 mineral lease with a defunct corporation. Our position is that the foreclosure extinguishes such a subordinate claim. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The only sound was the faint clicking of a computer keyboard. Is that a Pan-X lease? Mrs. Gable asked. Davies was taken aback. How could she possibly know? Yes, he said, it is. Ah, yes, she said, a hint of dry amusement in her voice. One of Frank Vance's. He did a few of those, caused a stir at the time. What's the filing number on the document? Helen, without being asked, read the number from her photocopy. F-76-312B. More clicking. The men in the room leaned in, listening to the speakerphone as if it were an oracle. Then Mrs. Gable spoke again, a voice clear and decisive, carrying the full weight of recorded history. That's not a lease, not in the normal sense, Mr. Henderson. It's a permanent surface rights covenant, filed and recorded with the original deed transfer. It was established before any of the bank's loans were ever attached to that parcel. It's a superior claim. It survives foreclosure. It survives anything short of a direct condemnation by the state. The bank sold the dirt, all right. But it looks like Mrs. Vance here owns the right to stand on it, and the right to keep anyone else off it. Silence. The three words echoed in the room. Owns the right. Not a claim, not an argument. Ownership. Mrs. Gable waited a moment. Is there anything else I can help you with? No, Eleanor, Henderson said, his voice a hoarse whisper. That was very clear. Thank you. He hung up the phone. The developer's man swore a single sharp word. He turned on Davies. You sold me a useless piece of rock, a landlocked parcel I can't get a bulldozer onto, let alone build a road. My project is stalled. My investors are going to be unhappy. This is a material breach of the sale agreement. He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed his briefcase from the floor and walked to the door. You'll be hearing from our lawyers, he said to Davies. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing in the funereal quiet of the room. The institutional confidence had shattered. Davies sat slumped in his chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a pale, grim line. Henderson stared at the phone as if he could unmake the call. The sailboat on the wall seemed to mock them, sailing on an endless, untroubled sea. The whole structure of assumption, of procedure, of what had always been done had been dismantled by a piece of paper from 1976 and a woman who had bothered to read it.
Davies slowly began to pack his briefcase. He snapped it shut with a sound of finality. He looked at Helen, and for the first time he saw her not as a problem, but as a person. His tone was utterly changed. There was no condescension left, only the weary sound of defeat. Mrs. Vance. He paused, correcting himself. Helen. Clearly, there has been a significant oversight on the bank's part. We failed to perform adequate due diligence on this title. He was admitting fault, a thing lawyers are trained never to do.
He stood up, buttoning his jacket, a reflexive gesture of trying to regain some professional composure.
The bank is, of course, willing to rectify this situation, he continued. We will have to unwind the sale with the developer. We will buy the parcel back. Then we would like to negotiate with you directly to purchase this surface rights covenant. He was talking about a settlement again, but this time he was not dictating terms. He was asking, "What is your price, Mrs. Vance, to release this claim, to make the land whole again?" He expected a high number, 50,000, 100,000. He had just seen her turn a worthless piece of paper into a multi-million-dollar roadblock. She held all the cards. She could name any price she wanted, and the bank, to save the larger development deal and avoid a massive lawsuit, would likely have to pay it. He braced himself for the demand. Helen looked at the polished table, at the reflection of the fluorescent lights on its surface.
She thought about the money, what she could do with it. Fix the roof, help her son with his kids' college funds, travel maybe, see the ocean Frank had always wanted to show her. The temptation was there, a warm and sensible pull. But then she thought of Fragg's hands writing contingencies on that shoebox. She thought of his quiet principle, never give up the right to walk your own ground. This wasn't about profit. It was about restoration. It was about bringing something crooked back to straight. It was about honoring the foresight of the man she had loved. She looked up at Davies. "The price is not for the rights," she said. "The rights are not for sale. The price is for the land." She let that sink in. Davies was confused. "What do you mean?" "The bank can buy the parcel back from the developer," she explained calmly. "And then you can sell it back to me." "For what price?" Davies asked, still not understanding. "For what was owed," she said. He stared at her, uncomprehending. "The original loan? The defaulted amount?" "Yes," she said. $8,500. The same price you just sold it for." Davies was speechless. He had been prepared for a battle, for greed, for a protracted and expensive negotiation. He was not prepared for this. For a justice that was not about enrichment, but about simple balance. He couldn't grasp the motive. It was an act of quiet, profound integrity that his world of contracts and bottom lines had no language for. He ran a hand through his hair, his professional mask completely gone. He looked at Henderson, who just gave a slow, resigned nod. Of course. That's what a Vance would do. Davies had to make a call. He stepped out into the hallway, his voice a low murmur. He was talking to a superior, likely a regional vice president. The words unprecedented, catastrophic oversight, and legally binding covenant drifted back into the room. Henderson poured a glass of water from the carafe on the credenza and pushed it toward Helen. She gave a small nod of thanks but didn't drink. She just waited. She had done her part. The rest was just the machinery of the world slowly, grudgingly, turning to catch up with a truth that had been waiting for 44 years. 10 minutes later, Davies returned. His face was pale. He looked exhausted. "The bank has authorized me to accept your terms, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice flat. "We will repurchase the land from the developer. We will then arrange a sale to you for the outstanding balance of the original loan. Our legal team will draw up the papers. It will take a few days." Helen nodded. "That's fine," she said. "I've waited this long." She stood up,
She reached across the table and picked up her two pieces of paper, the original lease and the photocopy of the filing. She folded them together neatly, creasing them along their original lines.
She slipped them back into the old manila envelope. The object that had changed the room was put away. She tucked the envelope into her coat pocket. She looked at Henderson, then at Davies. She did not smile. She did not say thank you. There was nothing to be thankful for. She had not been given a gift. She had simply taken back what was already hers. She turned and walked out of the conference room, her footsteps quiet on the thin corporate carpet. She left the two men standing in the wreckage of their assumptions, under the hum of the fluorescent lights, with a dead ficus and the picture of a boat that was going nowhere. The business was concluded, done. A week later, Helen walked the fence line of the small parcel. It was late afternoon, and the autumn sun cast long shadows across the rocky ground. The air was crisp and smelled of dry leaves and distant wood smoke. Her son, Mark, walked beside her. He had driven up from his home in the city after she called to tell him the news. He still couldn't quite believe it. He kicked at a loose stone. "I don't get it, Mum," he said. "You could have asked for anything. 50 grand, 100. They would have paid it. That lawyer sounded desperate." Helen stopped and rested a hand on a weathered cedar fence post. Frank had put this fence in himself back in the 50s. It was still standing straight and true. She looked out over the land. It wasn't much to look at. Mostly scrub oak and wild grasses, a steep grade that was no good for farming or building. Useless, as the men at the bank had thought. "Your father planted this," she said, her voice quiet. She wasn't talking about the scrub oak. He didn't believe in getting something for nothing. He believed in holding on to what was yours. He put that clause in the paper for a reason, not to get rich, to make sure a stranger couldn't take what was his, to make sure his family would always have the right to stand right here on this ground. Mark looked at his mother, at the quiet strength in her face. He was beginning to understand. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. It was a message sent across 4 decades, from a father to a son, carried by his mother. "Some things are planted for the next man," Helen said softly. "Sometimes the next man is you." She gave the old fence post a final, affectionate pat, and then continued her walk along the boundary of the land that was, once again, theirs. A promise kept in a shoebox. A truth that waited patiently for the right moment to be told. Patience has a long memory, and sometimes the deepest roots are the ones written on paper. But not all truths are recorded in a courthouse basement. Some are carved in stone, set by hand, and remembered by heart. If this story stayed with you, there's more like it. Next time, we go to the green hills of Vermont, where a retired stonemason is told his property line is wrong. The state surveyor drew the map. The developer bought the land next door. But the mason knew where his own father had set the boundary marker, a massive granite stone 100 years before. We'll see what holds.